Welcome to Straight Up with Marc Patrone. I am your host. Appreciate you tuning in, my friends. Well, the BC Human Rights Commissioner says treating illegal drug users like criminals is not only racist, it's a violation of their human rights. Kasari Govender says even mentioning the opioid crisis discriminates against users of potentially lethal drugs. Tristan Hopper writes about it in the pages of the National Post. Headline: BC Human Rights Chief declares it's colonialist to stigmatize drug use. So, according to the commissioner, talking about the overdose crisis implies that doing drugs like meth or fentanyl is inherently unsafe. Well, it was certainly unsafe for the 16,000 people who overdosed in British Columbia since 2016. But she says the real cause is the toxic chemical additives to those drugs. She wants more policies that allow drug users to shoot up without stigma. She wants more safe supply of drugs, including the distribution of free recreational opioids to drug users. Anyway, Tristan will be joining us shortly with that. The Liberals narrowly averted a critical defeat in the House of Commons on their budget yesterday. Prime Minister Mark Carney says the budget is all about protecting Canada's way of life.
Very pleased that we passed the budget vote. There are more votes, of course, to come through the budget process, but an important step for our country, protecting our communities, protecting our borders, protecting our way of life.
Now, two Conservatives did not take part in the vote, nor did certain members of the NDP who chose to abstain. Interim NDP leader Don Davies explains why.
Why is it the NDP's responsibility to avoid an election? Isn't that the Liberals' responsibility?
Yes, it is. In fact, it's all parliamentarians' job.
Why abstain? Why allow them the chance to not go to an election by abstain? Why make that choice?
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question.
You're saying it's the Liberals' job, but yet you're helping the Liberals avoid an election by abstaining. Why?
Look, there's 343 people in the House of Commons. I've said from the beginning that it's Mark Carney's responsibility as the Prime Minister of a minority government to craft a budget that can earn majority support. But at the same time, we're in a unique situation right now, 6 months after the last election, where Canadians don't want an election right now. I haven't heard anybody dispute that.
Now, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre posted this reaction to the budget's passing. Mark Carney's budget will drive up the cost of living on every Canadian, on food, on homes, and on everything else Canadians buy. Conservatives demanded an affordable budget for an affordable life. On behalf of the Canadians that Liberals have priced out of food, homes, and life, Conservatives voted no tonight on this costly credit card budget that gambles away Canada's future. Poilievre described the budget passing as a good day for Carney and his Brookfield buddies. While the singing of Canada's national anthem was not welcome at an event in Toronto where the Palestinian flag was raised at City Hall, police stopped a pro-Canada demonstrator who attempted to play a recording of the national anthem. Let's listen.
Don't bother me during the national anthem, please. Excuse me, don't touch my property, first of all. That's all Canada you just disrespected.
Canada officially recognized the state of Palestine on September 21st, along with countries including the UK and Australia. I'm now joined by Tristan Hopper in Victoria, British Columbia. He's the one who wrote that column, and you can read about it in the pages of the National Post. Welcome, Tristan.
Thanks for having me.
So the BC Human Rights Commissioner says treating illegal drug users like criminals is not only racist, it's a violation of their human rights. Have I got that right?
Basically, yeah. So you go through this report. So the context of the report is that on a few levels, BC is starting to dial back the extremes of how far it leaned into harm reduction. There's sort of three prominent examples of that. So BC debuted decriminalization in 2022. So this was any personal use amounts, anything below, I think, 2.5 grams of meth, heroin, all the illicit drugs. It was effectively legalized. And that was dialed back. And now you have the NDP Premier of BC saying openly, this was a mistake. So he's been saying, a lot of normal people have been saying ever since the beginning. He said, well, it was supposed to destigmatize drug use, but what it actually did is it normalized drug use everywhere all at once. You'll probably remember there was that BC Supreme Court decision soon after decriminalization came in. And there was an initial pullback from the BC NDP government. People were saying, hey, we can't play in playgrounds anymore because it's full of people shooting up and, smoking crack. And because you decriminalize drugs, we can't actually send police in to arrest them. So there's just crack smoke everywhere. We can't use the playground. So the BC NDP government said, okay, we're going to change it a bit. Drugs are still decriminalized, but you can't smoke meth or shoot up in playgrounds specifically. You have to, police can now ask you very politely, and there's still no sanction, but they can ask you to do it at the other end of the playground. And there was a BC Supreme Court decision which said, actually, no, that's a violation of their Section 7 rights, security of the person, etc. So, we had a court decision saying that. Anyway, that's beside the point. So they dialed back on decriminalization. We dialed back safer supply. This was another BC experiment where we thought, well, we can steer addicts away from the black market if we just distribute free recreational opioids. So, okay, if we just give you a daily ration of hydromorphone, which is a very powerful opioid, you won't do fentanyl. And, that might be, cut with something and that could kill you. The idea is that it wasn't the drugs that was the problem. It was all the weird additives in the drugs. So if we just have them doing the government drugs, but this is something the National Post, I think, has covered. My paper has covered better than almost anyone else, is diversion. So again, plenty of people could have told you this before you embarked on the program. Addicts are just going to take the hydromorphone, flip it for cash in the black market, and then use it to buy fentanyl because, the high is not as good. Any addict, you could have asked them and you would have learned that they did this. So we had massive diversion. So just huge drug rings of, an addict goes in, gets their ration, immediately sells it for harder drugs. And we just had this flood of hydromorphone at rock bottom prices hitting the black market. And something my colleague at the National Post, Adam Zivo, has covered is you have a bunch of high schoolers suddenly with, basically free hydromorphone all over the place, which has not been good for our overall drug addiction rate. So that was dialed back in February. And we've also had BC Premier David Eby talking about we need to start involuntarily putting people into treatment. If you are just a risk to yourself, you cannot get clean. There needs to be involuntary options. So sort of taking a page out of the treatment-based program out of Alberta. So those three things, that's the context. As this is happening, BC Human Rights Commissioner just puts together a 22-page statement saying all of this is wrong, saying what has been in BC literature underlying all of this. So there's no new thoughts, there's no new concepts in this report, because obviously, there's when you're legalizing people smoking meth in playgrounds, there's some kind of insane ideology underlying that. But it's weird to see it now in this context where plenty of very progressive people in BC have come around to the idea of, maybe it would be nice if our downtowns weren't exclusively filled with drug use all the time. Maybe there is a role, because we all know someone, we all know someone who has had their life consumed by addiction, and we all usually know someone, whether they were an alcoholic, whether they were on pills, they came out of the oil patch, addicted to something. We know it's possible for people to get clean. It doesn't need to be palliative care, and that's what it is. At the extremes of BC harm reduction is, okay, you're on drugs. We'll make the drug doing as safe as possible. We'll put you in a low barrier hotel. We'll make sure clinicians watch you as you shoot up. But that is your life. You're just sort of kept alive as a drug addict forever in perpetuity. But anyway, this BC Human Rights Commissioner says all the lines that have fueled all of this. This was what would have been said when, in the earliest days of Insight, this is what was said when you were having safer supply passed. And it's weird to see all these arguments now, knowing what we know, knowing that we've leaned harder into harm reduction than any other jurisdiction on the planet Earth. And all we've seen is overdose rates rise. And the BC Human Rights Commissioner learned absolutely nothing. The last 5 years have not happened to her. And we just get a report saying, "Oh, this is all colonialist, racist." She says we shouldn't even use the term overdose. It's a toxic drug crisis because it's safe to do drugs. It's just all the additives that all the criminals are putting in, and there's no role for law enforcement. So I mean, I just wrote about it because it is sort of indicative. We're all having experiences lately where there's a Supreme Court decision like, I'm sorry, putting a pedophile in prison is cruel and unusual punishment. What are you even talking about? And it is sort of illustrative of at very high and elite echelons and very well-paid echelons. Yeah. The BC Human Rights Commissioner gets $350,000 per year. She's one of the most highly paid bureaucrats in the BC system. You can just release a 22-page report very disconnected from any kind of modern reality. And there's no one in the office to sort of say why that might be a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, Kasari Govender makes Premier Eby look like a moderate.
Yeah, I mean, we pay our premiers pretty well. I think as a BC premier, Alberta's, they've always been the most high paid premier. It's kind of a prestigious thing, but $221,000, not bad. And yeah, you're looking at $350,000 for the BC Human Rights Commissioner, which is different from the BC Human Rights Tribunal. That's the one where you take someone to a quasi judicial thing. So they are separate agencies. So the Human Rights Commissioner is just will intervene on some cases, but this is essentially what the office does, and it's $8 million a year to release position statements like this, saying, stigmatizing drug use. Have you considered that that's actually colonialist and racist?
My favorite part of your column, as you referenced the report, was the fact that even the mere act of talking about it really is discriminatory. Let's read you part of this. According to the commissioner, discussing the overdose crisis implies that doing drugs such as meth or fentanyl is inherently safe. Well, it certainly turned out to be unsafe for the 16,000 people or so who overdosed in British Columbia since 2016.
Yeah, and the argument, and then I mean, still official government terms, it is referred to in coroner's reports as the toxic drug crisis, which, I mean, the root of that is the idea that, you can do these drugs safely. And I mean, that is said directly in the BC Human Rights Commissioner's report. I mean, they're being as safe as possible. If we just had systems and supports, they could just do drugs recreationally and this would be totally fine. And people don't believe me when I say that. When I say, oh, no, the people in charge of the drug, they do have the foundational ideology is that you can do hard drugs and it's totally fine and it's a lifestyle choice. I mean, that sounds crazy. I still think there's a lot of British Columbians who haven't accepted that is the idea at the core of all of this. But yeah, it's brought up in this report. And the idea is it's the toxic drug crisis because they're only dying of overdoses because they're otherwise safe drug consumption because they had to buy their drugs from the black market. They weren't getting the pure stuff. So it's, I guess, if you were to make a similar argument doing prohibition, it's like, well, the alcohol is totally fine for you under any context. The alcoholism doesn't even exist. It's just that we have some booze that is tainted with, antifreeze. And if we can just get everybody drinking the pure alcohol is 100% fine and there's no problems with it.
But she wants the government to adopt policies that push it more towards decriminalizing, right? To basically normalizing.
Yes, yeah. So as the government is saying, okay, we keep doing this because, I mean, I would ask people just to, I mean, we've had more shipments of fentanyl. I guess that's one outside force that has defined this. But 10 years ago, it wasn't too long ago when we had much lower rates of overdose. The numbers escape me, but it's exponentially higher now than it was 10 years ago when we were already calling it a crisis. The amount of harm reduction we had then was much lower than now. I mean, now it's normalized that everyone from security guards to hospital attendants to pharmacies have naloxone kits on. That didn't exist 10 years ago. You had a handful of safe injection sites. Now any mid-sized community anywhere in the country has multiple safe consumption sites. You have low barrier shelters. You have the safer supply system. And as I often remind people, this is very unique to us. Although harm reduction was pioneered as a European idea, the amount that we've sort of leaned into it, this doesn't exist in any sort of a European or American context. I mean, we're at the leading edge of doing this. And each one of these reforms that we implement, it's just meaning more and more people are dying of drug overdoses. So if you're just looking, and if someone was here, they would scream at me and say it's more complicated and more nuanced. But lots of harm reduction has correlated pretty closely with overdose rates remaining high. So it's been 10 years of trying harm reduction. Everything we do seems to make things worse. And she's saying, again, this is not particularly unique to her. This has been the case within many pro harm reduction circles, including many public health bodies. It was only a couple of years ago that you had the provincial health officer, Bonnie Henry, doing her review of safe supply. And this was one of the first government reports to acknowledge that diversion was happening. They denied it before then. They'd said it was misinformation. And then police started coming out and saying, we keep doing drug busts that are mostly safer supply, diverted safer supply. So it became too hard to ignore. And then you had the provincial health officer, Bonnie Henry, saying, the only reason this is happening is because the drugs aren't strong enough. So you had a review of safer supply, and Bonnie Henry herself, provincial health officer, our top doctor essentially, saying, okay, well, instead of hydromorphone, we need to start giving out fentanyl and smokable fentanyl, and we need to start putting it in rural areas where it may not be. You can get your drugs in the big city. We need to start sending just trucks of smokable fentanyl into First Nations communities. That's the only way to sort of stop the overdose crisis. So,
Unbelievable.
again, the BC Human Rights Commissioner is not, I guess, out of line. I mean, there's plenty of sort of people making more than $200,000 in the BC government that sort of share these sentiments, but I guess her report is unique in that it's there's almost no consideration that drugs are inherently bad, or there is a role for law enforcement in some context, which I think even a lot of very progressive lefty British Columbians are starting to come around to. They remember that you used to be able to ride public buses and there wasn't a guy tweaking out on meth.
Yeah, I mean, it almost makes you think there's a correlation between the amount of money these people are making and just how out of touch they are with reality. I mean, they advocate the distribution of free recreational opioids, to drug users, better access to quote unquote safe supply. I mean, how is this playing with the regular folks?
One thing I will that sort of strikes me about these types of reports is you'll see, well, the whole why are people taking drugs, and they'll say, well, it's the history of colonialism and racism and stuff. So you'll see often references to Indigenous people are hardest hit by this, and it's because of colonialism, and it's because of all this that's causing this. If you actually ask Indigenous communities who are hardest hit by the overdose crisis, I mean, however it's hitting the general population, and we're one of the highest places in the world for people dying of drug overdoses. It's exponentially higher in First Nations communities. What you are seeing in a lot of reserves is, you drive into the reserve and there's a big sign saying drug dealers not welcome. Communities exploring banishment. There was an incident, I'm forgetting if it was a few months ago or a year ago, where there was sort of a notorious drug dealer on Haida Gwaii, and he was actually exiled from the community. And as he was on the mainland, people were meeting him. People were sort of messaging each other on Facebook. This notorious drug dealer, make sure he can't stop for gas. Just keep hustling him out so he never comes back. So you have the hardest hit communities by this are advocating the old-fashioned drugs are bad. We should stop people from selling drugs in our communities. We should disincentivize the normalization. We should go back to stigmatizing drug use. And there's just no acknowledgement whatsoever from the BC Human Rights Commissioner. I mean, perhaps I can't imagine if you went to just sort of go to your hardest hit Indigenous drug community, get all the elders together, and try and explain to them that your solution is actually we need more drugs supplied by the governments, with fewer safeguards. I don't think it would go over well.
I don't think so either. Now, there are national implications to what's going on in British Columbia, right? As you mentioned, BC has kind of led the way with the decriminalizing stuff.
Yes.
And, Ontario's looking on, Quebec is looking at what's going on. So maybe talk a little bit about that. What's the likelihood that a report like this will have ramifications outside of BC?
I don't know. Probably in again, there's nothing in it that's particularly unique. I mean, she's just sort of recycling ideas that have been at the fringes. But the mainstream fringes. I mean, I call them fringe, but they are very much at the mainstream. I mean, you can read these ideas in reports guiding, federal and BC drug policy for years. It is, I mean, this is sort of my beat at the National Post, is I'll cover sort of, how institutions that have been captured by ideology. So, the Canadian Armed Forces puts out a report saying that Canadian society is systemically racist, and any unequal outcome is, but I'd say in drug policy, it still surprises me when I will be reading a high level report, signed on by any number of doctors with immense power over how public health, and you will see these ideas that seem crazy to the normal person. The idea that getting off drugs, getting clean from drugs is not a realistic or even desirable outcome. But in terms of implications, I don't know, because BC did lead the way. It wasn't too long ago that BC was the only place in Canada that had safe consumption sites. And they pioneered a model. The Inside people put out a bunch of extremely dodgy data, claiming that, safe injection sites make neighborhoods safer. It reduces drug overdoses. And I've written extensively about the data that they released, showing that it's incredibly dodgy data. It sucks. But I mean, the reason you live in a community, be it in Ontario, Nova Scotia, Quebec, in which you are walking distance to a safe consumption site or a low barrier shelter or whatever, any of these sort of temples of harm reduction, and if you're listening to this, you almost certainly do, is because of models that were pioneered by BC. But if BC is becoming skeptical of the effectiveness of these models, I think maybe we're past the era where people look to BC as a model of what to do. However, I guess what we can learn from this report is if you can have people in high echelons of power making $350,000 a year who can be so disconnected from reality, maybe your own province also has people that disconnected from reality. And if there's no pushback, maybe they will pursue these ideas.
And speaking of pushback, will there be any from David Eby, from the Premier, or how does he treat this? Because, a lot of people, I think, in his, maybe you want to say far left base, probably think that this is the best thing possible for BC and anyone else.
Eby sort of, he's interesting on these files because his background is he was a street level activist lawyer for groups like the Pivot Legal Society, who were very instrumental in, the quote unquote lawfare that enabled whole communities to sort of be roped off as drug doing areas. So in his younger life, he was very much at the front lines of ideas like this. So it's strange to see how David Eby reacts to these, because on the one hand, he's looking at systems that he personally helped implement as a younger man, but he also has sort of a visceral appreciation of how extreme and how crazy those groups can get. So we'll see sort of this isn't the most PC term, but we'll see sort of a schizophrenic view of David Eby. Well, on the one hand, he will do things like repeat the nostrums that, we have to reduce stigma, etc. But at the same time, he will sort of come out with ideas that are very controversial within the far left of his party, like involuntary care and treatment. He was pushing that. I think when he was first running for BC leader, he sort of came out and said, we can't just have people, doing drugs with. I mean, you have to take. If someone is like within 2 weeks of just overdosing, we have to put them in an institution and forcibly get them clean. He was bringing this up for quite a while, but he also dialed that back when his party started yelling at him. So it's sort of hard to nail him down on this, because you'll see one interview with David Eby and you're like, oh, that sounds pretty reasonable. That sounds like something I would say. And then you'll see an official statement from the Premier's office saying we have to decriminalize people who use drugs. Harm reduction is the way forward, blah, 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 blah. So perhaps that is a representation of BC as a whole. But right now, when I see David Eby speaking of drug policy, lately, it's usually to say perhaps we've gone too far and we should dial back and we should arrest drug dealers more than we have been doing.
Now, this has been an issue on the federal scene. It played out, there was discussions around it during the campaign, for instance. Carney said something about, well, we don't really have a crisis in terms of opiate overdosing. And then Poilievre skewered him, saying we've had 50,000 people die. Probably what is it now? 60,000? I don't know. We must be up to.
Federally, I think it's 53,000 since. One problem is we just our data sucks on this. So this is one thing that comes up in the BC Human Rights Commissioner's report. She'll claim, and this is technically legalistically true. She'll say, well, there's no evidence to show that having tons of government supplied opioids is increasing overdose deaths. The reason we don't have evidence is because they're not looking for it. The only metric they're using to determine whether it's having deleterious effects on public health is it wasn't showing up in a lot of autopsies of overdose victims. That was the only metric they were checking. Now, a normal person would say, well, if you're trying to see if high schoolers are getting more addicted, I mean, there's a bunch of different things you could possibly check. There are surveys, there are toxicology tests, someone shows up in the hospital. If you're just looking at whether it's in the corpses of people who have died, that may not be the best representation of the overall harm this might be doing. But I forget where you're going with that. So anyway, it is 50 to 60,000. I mean, our life expectancy has plateaued in this country. That's the first time that's happened basically ever, where life expectancy is going up every single year with a few extra months of life. MAID has contributed, but it's primarily the overdose crisis. You're taking people at the prime of their life and killing them. So yes, and in terms of countries, I think the only country whose rate is worse than us is Scotland. So if you take the UK as a whole, it's lower, but I mean, we are one of the places where it's most likely that you will die of a drug overdose.
Incredible. Well, if the government doesn't have that data, it probably doesn't want that data. It's probably reluctant to collect data that will be a condemnation of their policies.
So yeah, we do have, but again, you see things like they're called toxic drug deaths. So we can't even acknowledge that you can die of a drug overdose. So the toxic drug deaths are the sort of 50,000 to 60,000 range over, I think, since 2016.
Tristan, thank you so much for coming on the show. Congratulations on your terrific work at the National Post.
Thank you.
Tristan Hopper. And that is it for this edition of Straight Up. Appreciate you tuning in, my friends. Let's do it again real soon, shall we? Bye-bye for now.